Hello everyone, welcome to today's presentation. I'm excited to have you here. Today we'll be exploring Mega Goal 1.1, which focuses on Unit 6, Take My Advice, and dives into form, meaning, and function. We'll look at how advice is expressed, what it means, and how it works in different contexts. So let's get started and enjoy the journey through this interesting topic. Today, we'll focus on some essential rules to help you do the exercises correctly. First, it's important to understand how to use words connected with medicine properly. This means knowing which terms are appropriate and how they fit into sentences. Next, we'll look at forming clauses with when correctly, as this can often be tricky but is crucial for clear communication. We'll also practice expressing quantities accurately in sentences, which helps make your meaning precise. Another key point is distinguishing between countable and uncountable nouns. Recognizing the difference allows you to choose the right words and quantities. Then, we'll work on forming questions about quantities correctly, so you can ask and answer about how much or how many with confidence. Throughout this lesson, the goal is to connect these skills, using the right words, clauses, and question forms to enhance your overall language proficiency. These rules are the foundation for clear, accurate communication, especially in medical contexts. So let's keep these points in mind as we move forward. Let's look at some examples to understand this better. When we say 3 pens, we're talking about a plural form of the noun pen. Similarly, 2 pens is also plural, but if I say 1 pen, that's a singular form. This highlights an important point about countable nouns. Countable nouns are nouns that we can actually count. For example, 1 carrot, 2 carrots, and so on. They have both singular and plural forms. Now, to connect this to our overall theme, understanding the difference between singular and plural is crucial, because it helps us communicate clearly whether we're talking about one item or multiple items. In summary, countable nouns are those we can count, and they change form depending on whether we're talking about one or more. Recognizing this helps us use the correct form in our sentences. Now let's look at some examples of uncountable nouns, like water, sugar, and milk. These are words that you can't count individually, so you wouldn't say 1 water or 2 sugars. Instead, we just use these nouns as they are. An important point is that uncountable nouns don't take a or an before them. For example, you wouldn't say a water or an milk. And they also don't have plural forms, so you won't say waters or milks in most cases. So what's the difference between countable and uncountable nouns? Countable nouns are things you can count, like books or chairs. Uncountable nouns, on the other hand, are substances or concepts that are viewed as a whole, like water or sugar. Understanding this difference is crucial, because it affects how we use articles and plural forms in English. Recognizing whether a noun is countable or uncountable helps us speak and write more accurately. This ties into the overall theme of mastering English nouns and their usage, which is essential for clear and correct communication. Let's look at the difference between uncountable and countable nouns. In the first example, we ask, how much water do you drink a day? Water is an uncountable noun, which means we can't really count individual units of it. Instead, we use how much to ask about the quantity. On the other hand, in the second example, how many books are in the library? Books are countable nouns, so we use how many to ask about the number of individual items. It's important to remember that for uncountable nouns, we say how much, and for countable nouns, we ask how many. When you're forming questions, the phrase, how many is used with countable nouns, and how much is used with uncountable nouns. This distinction is key in understanding how to ask about quantities correctly, and it ties into the overall theme of mastering noun usage in English. Today, I want to talk about some common words that can be a bit tricky because they can be used with both uncountable and countable forms, depending on the context. For example, words like salt and grapes are typically countable. You can say a grape or many grapes, and a salt is rarely used, it's usually uncountable. On the other hand, words like music, Cakes or bag are generally countable. You might have a cake or 2 bags. But some words, like music, are uncountable when you refer to the general concept, as in I enjoy music, but countable when you specify types like musics, though that's less common. Some words like cash are interesting because they are often uncountable when you talk about money in general, but you can count specific amounts, such as a cash, which is rare, or cash payments. Then we have lemon and flower, which are usually uncountable. You wouldn't normally say 1 lemon unless you're referring to a specific lemon, but lemon can be countable when talking about individual fruits. Flour, however, is almost always uncountable since it's a substance. Similarly, olive oil is uncountable because it's a liquid, but olive itself is countable as individual fruits. Finally, words like bridge are clearly countable because you can have 1 bridge or multiple bridges. Understanding whether a noun is countable or uncountable helps us use the correct articles and quantifiers, which is key to mastering English. This distinction plays a big role in how we communicate quantity and specificity across different contexts. Now, let's talk about countable and uncountable nouns. This is a really important concept because it helps us understand how to use nouns correctly in sentences. Countable nouns are things we can count individually, like apples, books, or chairs. You can say 1 apple, 2 apples, or 3 chairs. Uncountable nouns, on the other hand, refer to things that we think of as a whole or in a mass, like water, rice, or information. You wouldn't say 1 water or 2 rices. Instead, you'd say some water or a lot of rice. Recognizing the difference helps us choose the right words and articles, like a or an for countable nouns, and some or much for uncountable ones. This distinction is key to making your sentences clear and grammatically correct, which ties into our overall theme of mastering proper English usage. So here we're looking at the question, how much food did he steal? It's important to understand that when we talk about how much, we're referring to the quantity or volume of food and drinks involved. This helps us grasp the scale of what happened. Then the slide mentions, someone stole food and drinks, which indicates that the theft wasn't just limited to 1 item. It's about multiple items, showing a larger breach or issue. Next, there's the question, how many? Which is a shift from asking about quantity to asking about the number of items or people involved. It emphasizes that sometimes we need to clarify whether we're talking about the amount or the count. Then we see, oh no, I was wrong. This is a reminder that initial assumptions can be mistaken, and it's crucial to verify facts before jumping to conclusions. Finally, the slide asks again, how much? Reinforcing the importance of precisely understanding the extent of the theft, whether in terms of volume, value, or quantity. Connecting this to the overall theme, it highlights how important accurate measurement and clear questions are when analyzing situations, whether it's in data, investigations, or problem solving. It's a good reminder that asking the right questions helps us get to the truth more effectively. So in this slide, we're looking at a situation where he stole some apples. The key question here is, how much did he actually take? At first, I might have thought I knew, but then I realized, oh no, I was wrong. That's an important reminder that our initial assumptions can sometimes lead us astray. Now we're asking again, how many apples did he steal? And this time, we're focusing on the actual number. The main point here is the importance of carefully determining the quantity. How many apples are involved? So, the big question we're trying to answer is, how many apples did he steal? This ties into our overall theme of understanding quantities and making accurate estimations or calculations based on the information we have. So, here we see 2 common questions that often come up when we're talking about quantities. First, how much is used when we're referring to uncountable nouns like sugar, water, or air? For example, if someone stole some sugar, we might ask, how much sugar did he steal? This helps us understand the quantity, even if we can't count individual units. On the other hand, how many is used with countable nouns, such as apples, books, or people. If we wanted to know the number of apples stolen, we would ask, how many apples did he steal? It's important to choose the right question based on whether the noun is countable or uncountable. Now I want to point out a common mistake. Sometimes people get confused and ask how many for uncountable nouns or how much for countable ones. That's when errors happen, like I did earlier. I thought I knew, but I was wrong. Finally, there's how much again, which emphasizes the quantity of something uncountable. It's a flexible question that helps us gauge the amount of things we can't easily count. Remember, understanding when to use how much versus how many is key to communicating clearly about quantities. It ties back to the overall theme of mastering language precision for effective communication. All right, let's look at some key questions we often ask when dealing with quantities. First up is how many. This is used when we're talking about countable items, like bottles of water. For example, if he stole some bottles of water, we want to know exactly how many. So we ask, how many bottles of water did he steal? Notice how this helps us get a clear number. Next, there's how much, which is different. We use how much when we're dealing with uncountable quantities like water itself. Sometimes we might think we know the answer, but then realize we were wrong. Like in the example here, oh no, I was wrong. That shows us the importance of checking our assumptions. Finally, we revisit how many again, emphasizing its role in counting discrete items. This slide highlights how crucial it is to choose the right question based on whether we're counting individual units or measuring amounts. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding these distinctions helps us communicate more accurately and make better decisions about quantities. Now let's look at some common questions we use when talking about quantities. First, we have how much. This is typically used when we're referring to uncountable nouns, like liquids or substances. For example, how much orange juice did he steal? Here, we're asking about the amount of juice, which you can't count individually. Next, we see the phrase, he stole some orange juice. Notice that we use some to indicate an unspecified amount of the juice. Then we have a question. Orange juice did he steal? This is where how much fits in because we're asking about the quantity of the juice stolen. The key point here is that how much is used with uncountable nouns to inquire about the amount. Now, shifting gears a bit, we have how many. This question word is used when we're talking about countable nouns. For instance, if we're asking about the number of oranges stolen, we'd say, how many oranges did he steal? And finally, the phrase, oh no, I was wrong, reminds us that sometimes we might initially guess the quantity, but then realize we need to reconsider. It's a natural part of learning, making mistakes and correcting ourselves as we go. Overall, understanding the difference between how much and how many helps us ask the right questions about quantities, depending on whether the noun is countable or uncountable. This is essential for clear communication, especially when discussing amounts or numbers in any context. Now, let's look at the difference between countable and uncountable nouns, using these examples. She does not have many friends. Here, friends is a countable noun, so we use many. Many is used when we're talking about things that you can count individually, like oranges or children. On the other hand, for uncountable nouns, we use much. For example, I don't have much money. Money here is uncountable, so we say much. Uncountable nouns refer to things that you can't count individually, like water or sand. So the key takeaway is that many is used with countable nouns, and much is used with uncountable nouns. Understanding this helps us choose the right word when we're talking about quantities. This is essential for clear and correct communication, especially when discussing amounts or quantities in English. Today, let's explore the difference between many and much. These words are both used to talk about quantities, but they are used in different contexts. Many is used with countable nouns, things you can count individually like apples, books, or friends. For example, you might say, there are many apples in the basket. On the other hand, much is used with uncountable nouns, which are things you can't count individually, like water, money, or information. For instance, you might say, there isn't much water left. Recognizing whether a noun is countable or uncountable is key to choosing the right word. This distinction helps us communicate more accurately and clearly, especially when we're describing quantities. So, always think about whether your noun can be counted or not, and that will guide you to the correct choice between many and much. Let's take a look at some common ways we use many and much. These words help us describe quantities, but they are used differently depending on whether we're talking about countable or uncountable nouns. For example, in the first sentence, we saw many animals at the zoo. Here, animals are countable, so we say many. In the second sentence, we're asking, how much oranges did you put in the box? Actually, for oranges, which are countable, we should say many. But if we were talking about juice, which is uncountable, we would use much. Moving on, in the third sentence, there isn't much sugar in my coffee. Since sugar is uncountable, much is correct here. Similarly, in the fourth sentence, I don't have many friends. Friends are countable, so many fits. In the fifth sentence, the old man hasn't got much hair on his head. Hair, when talking about a general amount, is uncountable, so much is used. Next, I've packed many bottles of water. Bottles are countable, so many makes sense here. In the seventh sentence, I didn't get much sleep last night. Sleep, as a concept, is uncountable, so much is appropriate. Finally, in the eighth sentence, how much fruit do you eat in an average day? Fruit can be both countable and uncountable depending on context, but generally, when referring to an amount, much is used. The key takeaway is that many is used with countable nouns, and much is used with uncountable nouns. Recognizing whether a noun is countable or uncountable helps us choose the correct word to describe quantity accurately. This distinction is essential for clear, precise communication, especially as we discuss different types of nouns in our language. Now let's look at how we use a little with uncountable nouns. For example, I might say, I need a little sugar in my tea. Here, sugar is uncountable, and using a little helps express that I want some, but not a lot. It's a positive way to describe a small quantity of something uncountable. On the other hand, with countable nouns, we often use a few. For instance, there are a few apples in the fridge. Apples are countable, and a few indicates a small but sufficient number of them. The key point to remember is that a little pairs with uncountable nouns, while a few goes with plural countable nouns. This distinction is important because it helps us communicate quantities clearly and naturally, depending on whether we're talking about things we can count or things we can't. Connecting this to the overall theme, understanding these differences allows us to express ourselves more accurately and confidently in everyday conversations. Now let's look at how we use a lot of with different types of nouns. First, with uncountable nouns like sugar, we say there is a lot of sugar in the kitchen. It doesn't matter how much sugar there is, we just say a lot of to express a large quantity. On the other hand, with countable nouns like students, we say there are a lot of students in the class. Again, a lot of works regardless of the quantity, whether it's many or few. Here's an important point. A lot of is versatile and can be used with both countable and uncountable nouns. Sometimes you might also hear lots of instead of a lot of, and they mean the same thing. For example, you could say lots of sugar or lots of students, and both are correct. Understanding this helps us describe quantities more naturally and accurately, no matter what kind of noun we're talking about. This is a key part of using English expressions for talking about amounts or quantities in everyday conversation. Now, let's look at the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. When I say I have lots of toy cars, I'm using a countable noun because cars can be counted individually. On the other hand, when I say there is lots of milk in the glass, milk is uncountable because you can't count milk in individual units. The word lots of is very flexible. It means a large number or amount, and it can be used with both countable and uncountable nouns. Remember, a lot of and lots of are interchangeable, so you can use either depending on what sounds better for you. This is a key point because understanding this helps you express quantity correctly, whether you're talking about things you can count or things you measure. So, Whether you're referring to many objects or a large amount of something uncountable, lots of works perfectly. Let's take a closer look at some common quantifiers. Much, many, a lot of or lots of, few, many again, and much once more. These words help us describe quantities, but they are used differently depending on whether we're talking about countable or uncountable nouns. For example, many and a lot of are used with countable nouns like apples or books. So you might say, I have many friends, or there are lots of cars on the road. On the other hand, much and a lot of are used with uncountable nouns like water or information. For instance, there isn't much time left, or she has a lot of experience. Now, when we want to express a small quantity, we often use few for countable nouns, meaning not many, but some. So, there are few chairs in the room implies that the number of chairs is limited. Interestingly, many is also used to emphasize larger quantities, but in a more formal context. It's important to remember that much and few are generally used in negative sentences or questions. For example, there isn't much sugar, or are there few options? This helps us communicate whether quantities are sufficient or limited. Overall, understanding how to choose between these words helps us be precise and clear in describing quantities, which is essential for effective communication. Now let's take a look at this sentence. There are only onions. To complete it correctly, we need to choose the right word from the options provided. In this case, since we're talking about a small quantity of onions, the best choice is few. So the complete sentence reads, there are only a few onions. This example highlights the importance of understanding countable versus uncountable nouns and selecting the appropriate quantifier. Remember, few is used with countable nouns like onions, while little is used with uncountable nouns, such as milk or water. Choosing the correct word helps convey the right amount and makes your communication clearer. So, in this context, few is the right word to complete the sentence accurately. Now let's look at this sentence. There is a cheese. To complete it correctly, we need to choose the right word from the options provided. When talking about cheese, or any countable or uncountable nouns, the word we select can change the meaning quite a bit. For example, if we say, there is a little cheese, we're implying that there's a small amount of cheese, which is often true when you're talking about a specific, limited amount. On the other hand, words like much and many are used in different contexts. Much with uncountable nouns and many with countable nouns. Some and a few can also be used, but in this case, since cheese is generally uncountable, some would be the most appropriate choice. Little in this context emphasizes a small quantity, which fits well with describing cheese. So, when you're filling in the blank, think about the quantity you're describing and the type of noun, countable or uncountable, to choose the most correct word. Now let's look at how we can complete this sentence correctly. We have the phrase, there isn't cake left. The goal here is to choose the right word that makes sense in context. If we say much, that refers to uncountable nouns, and cake can be considered uncountable when talking about the amount of it. So, there isn't much cake left is correct here. On the other hand, words like little and few are also quantifiers, but little is used with uncountable nouns and few with countable nouns. Since cake is uncountable in this context, little would also work, but much is more commonly used with uncountable nouns when talking about quantity. Other options like some can be used in affirmative sentences, but not in negatives like this one. Many refers to countable nouns, so it wouldn't be correct with cake. And no is a bit different. It signifies 0, but here we're focusing on choosing the right quantifier. So remember, when we're talking about uncountable nouns like cake, the most appropriate words are much or little. And in this particular sentence, much fits best because it emphasizes the quantity that remains. This is a great example of how understanding the difference between countable and uncountable nouns helps us choose the correct quantifier. Now let's look at how to complete the sentence using the correct word. The sentence is, there is milk in the fridge. We have several options here. Little, few, no, any, lots of, many. When talking about milk, which is an uncountable noun, we typically use words like little or a lot of. So, if there is a small amount of milk, we say, there is little milk in the fridge. If there's a large amount, we say, there is lots of milk in the fridge. It's important to remember that few and many are used with countable nouns, so they don't fit here. And no can be used if there's none at all. Any is often used in questions or negative sentences, but it can also be used in affirmative sentences to mean some. So, by clicking the right word, you'll learn how to properly complete sentences like this about uncountable nouns. This helps us communicate more clearly about quantities in everyday situations. Now, let's look at how we ask questions about quantities using different words. For example, when we want to ask about eggs, we say, how eggs are there? Here, we have several options like little, few, no, much, many, and lots of. The key is to choose the right word, depending on what you're asking about. If we're talking about countable nouns like eggs, we typically use few or many. Few means a small number, while many indicates a large number. If we're talking about uncountable nouns like milk, we use little or much. Little suggests a small amount, and much refers to a large amount. No is used when there are zero of something. Lots of is a more informal way to say there are many or a lot of items. So remember, the choice of the word depends on whether the noun is countable or uncountable. And in this activity, you'll click on the right word to complete each sentence correctly. Now let's look at this sentence. There is only a orange juice. To complete it correctly, we need to choose the right word from the options provided. When talking about quantities with uncountable nouns like orange juice, we typically use words like little or some. In this case, because the sentence emphasizes that the amount is small, the best fit is little. So, the complete sentence would be, there is only a little orange juice, meaning there's a small amount of orange juice available. It's important to remember that little is used with uncountable nouns to express a small quantity, while few is for countable nouns. The options like much, many, or lots of are also related to quantities but in different contexts. So, when you're filling in these kinds of blanks, always think about whether the noun is countable or uncountable to choose the most appropriate word. Now let's look at this sentence. There are only strawberries. To complete it correctly, we need to choose the right word from the options provided. Since we're talking about strawberries in small quantity, the most suitable word here is few. So the complete sentence would be, there are only a few strawberries. It's important to understand that few is used with countable nouns like strawberries, meaning not many of them. This contrasts with words like little, which are used with uncountable nouns. Recognizing these differences helps us communicate more accurately and naturally in English. So remember, if you're referring to a small number of countable items, few is the right choice. This small detail can really change the clarity of your message and improve your overall language skills. So when we look at the phrase a little, we're talking about small quantities or degrees of something. It's often used to indicate a modest amount that might not be enough to make a big difference, but still worth noting. For example, a little can refer to a slight increase in efficiency or a small amount of effort needed. Moving to a few, this suggests a slightly larger, but still limited, number of items or instances. Think of it as enough to be noticeable but not overwhelming. For example, a few can refer to a handful of options or a couple of considerations that are worth exploring. Throughout our discussion, these phrases help us understand and communicate nuances in quantity and intensity. Recognizing when to use a little versus a few helps us be more precise and effective in our messaging. Ultimately, these small words play a big role in shaping how we describe and interpret data, situations, or decisions. They connect to the overall theme of understanding subtle differences and making informed choices based on small, but meaningful, variations. Let's talk about my habits throughout the week. I exercise a lot during the week, which helps me stay active and energized. However, on weekends, I tend to do only a little exercise, just enough to relax and recharge. When it comes to hydration, I drink a lot of water every day. Staying well hydrated is important for my health, but especially when I get busy, I might drink a little less water, though I still try to keep it consistent. Now, regarding my eating habits, I do indulge in some junk food occasionally, but only a little. Most of the time, I try to avoid it. Still, I do eat a few snacks now and then, which is normal as part of a balanced approach. During the summer, I eat a lot of fruit. It's refreshing and healthy. But in winter, I tend to eat only a little fruit, mainly because it's less available and I prefer warmer foods. As for visiting the doctor, I go a few times a year. I believe in regular checkups to stay on top of my health. However, I don't go much, only when I feel sick or notice something that needs attention. Overall, these habits reflect my approach to maintaining a healthy lifestyle, balancing activity, hydration, diet, and medical care. It's all about moderation and being attentive to my body's needs. These two questions are focused on understanding what a person usually does in specific situations. Essentially, they're asking about typical behavior patterns. When you're answering these questions, think about your everyday responses or habits in those scenarios. It's important because these questions help reveal consistent tendencies, which can be useful for understanding personality or decision-making styles. You'll notice that they're not asking about what you might do in a perfect or ideal situation, but rather what you usually do. Connecting this to the overall theme of the presentation, these questions are key in assessing behavioral tendencies, which can influence how individuals approach problems, interact with others, or handle stress. So, when you answer, be honest and reflect on your natural responses. That's where the most insightful information lies. Let's look at some simple examples. I feel great. When I say that, I'm sharing how I feel on a good day, maybe after some exercise or just because I'm in a good mood. Now, how do you feel when you exercise? For many, exercise can make you feel energized or tired, but it's important to recognize those feelings. Next, I take aspirin. This is a common action when someone has a headache or a cold. So, what do you do when you have a cold? Usually, people rest, drink fluids, or take medication like aspirin to feel better. These examples help us understand how we express our feelings or actions related to health. Recognizing these patterns is key to understanding health conversations, which ties into the overall theme of how we communicate about health and well-being. I feel strong, great, happy, tired. How do you feel when you exercise? Let's practice. Think about how exercise impacts your feelings. Sometimes you might feel energized and accomplished, and other times maybe a bit exhausted. Understanding these feelings helps us recognize the connection between our physical activity and emotional well-being. So, as we go through this, I want you to consider your own experiences and how exercise influences how you feel in the moment. This awareness is key to developing a healthy relationship with physical activity and making it a positive part of your life. Let's practice some common situations and how we respond to them. First, what do you do when you feel tired? Well, I go to bed and try to have an early night to rest up. Next, what about when you have a cough? I take some cough syrup to help soothe my throat. And if you're feeling stressed and anxious, I try to relax, maybe take deep breaths or do something calming. Now, what do you do when you catch the flu? I usually stay in bed and take medicine to help recover. What about if you have a rash? I use a cream to soothe the skin. Finally, if you have a toothache, what do? I take painkillers to manage the pain. These are simple ways to care for ourselves in different health situations, and it's important to know what to do when these common problems arise. All right, for your homework, please turn to workbook page 284. There, you'll find exercises labeled L and M. These exercises are designed to reinforce what we've covered today, so I encourage you to take your time and work through them carefully. Remember, practicing these concepts helps solidify your understanding and prepares you for future lessons. If you encounter any difficulties, don't hesitate to review the related material or ask for help. Completing these exercises is a great way to connect everything we've discussed and ensure you're on track. So, take your time, focus on the details, and I look forward to seeing your progress.